At the edge of Lake Superior, where the water stretches so far it feels like the end of the world, stands a mansion that's as breathtaking as it is unsettling. You might see it first as a monument to success, stone walls, ornate staircases, glimmering chandeliers. But if you listen closely, the silence inside seems to hum with something else entirely. Something cold, something hidden. This is Glensheen, a mansion that once embodied the very heart of America's Gilded Age ambition, and later became infamous for a story so dark it nearly erased everything it stood for. It's easy to get distracted by the beauty of the place. The estate rests along the rocky shoreline in Duluth, Minnesota, overlooking the relentless waves of the largest freshwater lake in the world. Built in the early 1900s, Glensheen was more than a home. It was a statement, a declaration of triumph during an era when America was exploding with wealth, invention, and power. But like most things that glittered in the Gilded Age, it was also built atop deep contradictions. For every fortune made, there were lives ground down beneath it. For every mansion erected, there was a shadow it cast. And in Glensheen's shadow, something tragic would eventually stir, a story that would haunt the estate for decades. To understand what really happened inside this mansion, we have to go back to its beginning. The man who built Glensheen wasn't some idle heir to old wealth. His name was Chester Adgate Congdon, and in many ways he was the embodiment of the American dream. Born in 1853 in upstate New York to modest means, Chester didn't inherit luxury. He built it. He was the son of a Methodist minister, raised on the values of hard work, faith, and education, values that would define the way he climbed his way through the world. When he arrived in Minnesota in the late 19th century, Duluth was booming. It was the height of the iron ore rush, a time when the state's vast northern wilderness was being stripped and mined for the raw materials that would build America's cities, railroads, and industries. Chester Congdon was no miner. He was a lawyer, but a lawyer with vision. He represented some of the most powerful mining interests in the region and quickly learned that the real money wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the ore itself. By investing wisely and by knowing exactly when and where to place his trust, Congdon became staggeringly wealthy. Iron made him rich, but what made him truly remarkable was how he chose to display that wealth. Unlike some of his contemporaries who built their fortunes in secrecy or flaunted them in endless parties, Chester had a vision of refinement. He wanted to create something enduring, something beautiful, an estate that would represent his values, his family, and his belief in progress. So in 1905, he began construction on Glensheen, his dream home overlooking the wild, icy expanse of Lake Superior. The name itself, Glensheen, came from the word glen, meaning a secluded valley, and sheen, a shine or gleam. It was meant to evoke light and isolation, a shimmering retreat away from the chaos of the modern world. The mansion took 3 years to complete and cost around $850,000 at the time, roughly equivalent to over $30 million today. Designed by the famous architect Clarence H. Johnston Sr., Glensheen wasn't just big, it was brilliant. Every inch of it was meticulously thought out. Hand-carved oak woodwork, Tiffany glass, silk wall coverings, imported marble, bronze fixtures, nothing was spared. But beneath all that grandeur was a philosophy. Chester believed deeply in education, civic responsibility, and innovation. The estate was modern for its time. Electric lighting, running water, central heating, amenities that many homes, even among the wealthy, didn't yet have. Chester wanted Glensheen to represent progress itself. He and his wife Clara had 7 children, and this mansion was meant to be a sanctuary for them. You can almost picture it, children running through the halls, the lake breeze slipping through the open windows, the sound of pianos and laughter echoing through the great rooms. It was the kind of life people in the early 1900s dreamed about. But history, as we know, has a way of tarnishing perfection. The Congdons weren't immune to tragedy. Chester himself would die unexpectedly in 1916, only a few years after completing Glensheen. His death marked the beginning of a slow unraveling, one that would stretch across decades. His wife Clara continued to live in the mansion with several of their children, but as time went on, the grand estate began to feel more like a relic of another age. The Gilded Age itself was fading too. America was changing. The Jazz Age, the Depression, the wars, all of it reshaped what wealth, class, and legacy meant, and Glensheen stood through it all, towering and silent, a reminder of a vanished world. Yet it's the 1970s that would forever seal Glensheen's place in infamy. Long after the last of the original Congdons had passed away, the estate became the site of one of Minnesota's most shocking crimes, a double murder that shattered the illusion of this beautiful mansion and revealed the unsettling secrets buried within it. But before we get there, it's important to understand the family who lived there. Because the events that unfolded weren't random. They were rooted in years of quiet tension, control, inheritance, and power. After Chester's death, his daughter Elizabeth became one of the most prominent figures associated with the mansion. She was known to be intelligent, dignified, and fiercely independent, yet she lived much of her life in the shadow of her father's wealth and ideals. Like many children of the Gilded Age elite, she inherited not only money, but expectations, a responsibility to maintain a legacy, to live with grace, to be a custodian of her family's name. Elizabeth had no children of her own, but she remained deeply connected to her nieces and nephews. One of them would later play a role in the tragedy that would consume Glensheen. As the years passed, the house began to feel less like a home and more like a monument, grand but hollow, filled with memories that had lost their owners. Visitors to Glensheen today often say it feels frozen in time, as if someone just stepped out of the room moments before you arrived. The furnishings, the photographs, the details, all perfectly preserved. But if you linger in certain rooms, it's hard not to sense the weight of what's missing. Because behind the oak paneling and velvet drapes, Glensheen hides something darker than faded opulence, something that speaks to what happens when money, family, and obsession mix in just the wrong way. The night of June 27, 1977, would change everything. But to grasp the true magnitude of what occurred that night, the why, not just the how, we have to go deeper into the minds and motivations of the people who called this mansion home. What drove them, what they feared losing, and how decades of unspoken resentment could twist into something unthinkable. Glensheen wasn't just a mansion. It was a mirror of its era, an age that promised that wealth could buy happiness, permanence, and even morality. But within those promises lay the seeds of its downfall. The tragedy that would one day unfold here didn't come from outside. It was born within those walls. And once you know what happened, you'll never see Glensheen's beauty the same way again. By the time the 1970s arrived, Glensheen had become a place out of sync with its surroundings. Duluth, once a booming industrial hub, had slowed down. The iron wealth that built the Congdon fortune no longer roared through the city like it once did. The mansion, sitting quietly on its sweeping grounds, felt almost like an echo, grand, immaculate, but strangely lonely. The world around it had changed, but Glensheen hadn't. Its ornate halls still shimmered with the memory of the Gilded Age, but behind those carved doors, the family's story had started to take a darker turn. At the center of it all was Elizabeth Congdon, the last surviving daughter of Chester and Clara. She had inherited not only the estate but the immense Congdon wealth, and by all accounts, she lived a life defined by generosity and quiet dignity. She never married but adopted 2 daughters, Marjorie and Jennifer, giving them the Congdon name and the privileges that came with it. But as anyone who has studied old money families knows, inheritance can be both a blessing and a curse. The Congdons were no exception. Elizabeth was gentle, almost soft-spoken, the kind of person who didn't seem to fit the archetype of a ruthless heiress. Friends described her as kind, charitable, and deeply compassionate, someone who spent her time supporting local institutions, the arts, and education. Yet she was also a woman born into a system of control, where money wasn't just power, it was structure, identity, and expectation. Her adopted daughter Marjorie was different. From a young age, she was known to be charming, intelligent, and confident, but also volatile. There was a restlessness about her, a hunger that seemed to go beyond what her inheritance could satisfy. She grew up in a world where every luxury was within reach, yet somehow it was never enough. People close to the family began to notice the tension between mother and daughter. Elizabeth, pragmatic and cautious, was careful about money. Marjorie, on the other hand, lived as if it were an endless resource. By adulthood, Marjorie's life had become increasingly chaotic. Failed marriages, questionable financial decisions, and constant drama that left a trail of concern and whispers behind her. Still, Elizabeth never abandoned her. Despite their differences, she remained devoted to Marjorie, helping her financially again and again. But by the mid-1970s, even Elizabeth's patience was wearing thin. The once generous mother had started to place restrictions on how her money could be accessed, wary of what her daughter might do with it. And that's where the story takes a sharp, chilling turn. On the surface, the Congdons still appeared to be a family of privilege and refinement. Glensheen itself stood as a living museum of that illusion, its marble floors, its glittering chandeliers, the grand staircase curving upward like something out of a dream. But beneath the beauty, resentment was brewing. The question of inheritance, of who would control the Congdon fortune, had begun to corrode the family from within. In 1977, Elizabeth was 83 years old. She lived at Glensheen with a small staff, including her night nurse, Velma Pietola. Velma was devoted, loyal, and protective, a constant presence in Elizabeth's later years. To the outside world, the mansion seemed calm, its days marked by routine. But inside, a storm was building, and it would break in a single night. June 27th began like any other summer evening. The lake outside was calm, the air cool. Elizabeth retired to her bedroom as usual, Velma keeping watch nearby. No one could have imagined that within hours the peace of Glensheen would be shattered forever. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, an intruder entered the mansion. It was a place not easily breached, massive oak doors, heavy locks, and a sprawling layout that could confuse even those who'd visited before. But whoever entered that night knew what they were doing. When staff arrived the next morning, they were greeted by a sight that would haunt Duluth for decades. The nurse, Velma Pietola, was found dead at the bottom of the grand staircase, her body cold and battered. Upstairs in her bedroom, Elizabeth Congdon lay lifeless on her pillow. A silk robe, twisted and torn, told the story of a struggle. The wealthy heiress, the last true guardian of the Congdon name, had been murdered in her sleep. The scene was surreal, violence amid elegance, blood on the marble of America's gilded dreams. Police swarmed the estate, and within hours news of the murders spread across Minnesota. How could something like this happen in one of the state's most famous homes, to one of its most respected families? At first, it seemed like a robbery gone wrong. Drawers were open, jewelry missing, and the signs of intrusion were clear. But investigators quickly began to suspect otherwise. There was something too deliberate about the crime, something personal. And the deeper they dug, the more it appeared that this wasn't about theft, it was about inheritance. Suspicion turned inevitably to Marjorie. Her reputation preceded her, mounting debts, legal troubles, and a long history of conflicts with her mother over money. But even more damning was her husband, Roger Caldwell, whose life had become entangled with hers in increasingly destructive ways. Roger, once a charming and ambitious man, had spiraled alongside Marjorie into financial ruin. Together, they had become desperate. As investigators pieced together the events leading up to the murders, a disturbing picture emerged. Roger had traveled from Colorado to Minnesota shortly before the killings. His alibi was weak, his behavior erratic, and his connection to Marjorie's inheritance impossible to ignore. When police discovered that the couple stood to gain millions upon Elizabeth's death, motive and opportunity began to align in a way that was hard to dismiss. Still, proving it wouldn't be easy. There was no direct witness, no clear confession, and the case against them relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. But what investigators did have were inconsistencies, phone calls that didn't add up, stories that shifted, and a pattern of lies that pointed toward something far more sinister than coincidence. As the case moved toward trial, the media descended on Duluth. Glensheen, once a quiet symbol of refinement, became the center of a sensational murder mystery. Reporters called it Minnesota's Mansion of Death. The story had everything: wealth, greed, betrayal, and murder. And in the middle of it all was Marjorie Congdon, the heiress who seemed to live in the gray space between victim and villain. Roger Caldwell was eventually arrested and charged with the murders of Elizabeth Congdon and Velma Pietola. His trial was a spectacle, the kind that exposes everything about both a family and a society obsessed with the fall of the powerful. Prosecutors painted him as a desperate man, manipulated by his wife's hunger for money. The defense argued he had been framed, that there was no physical evidence tying him directly to the crime. And yet, when the verdict came, the room fell silent. Guilty. Roger Caldwell was sentenced to life in prison, and the public breathed a kind of uneasy sigh of relief. Justice, it seemed, had been served. But beneath that surface, doubts lingered. Some believed Roger had been a pawn, that Marjorie's influence ran far deeper than anyone wanted to admit. As years went on, new evidence, confessions, and retractions would muddy the case further, blurring the lines between guilt and manipulation, love and control. The tragedy of Glensheen was no longer just about murder. It had become a psychological labyrinth of greed, deceit, and self-destruction. And as the mansion stood there, still beautiful, still cold, its silence began to feel heavier. Because even after the trials, after the headlines faded, one question refused to die. Was the real mastermind behind Glensheen's dark secret ever truly brought to justice? After Roger Caldwell's conviction, it seemed like the tragedy at Glensheen had found its grim conclusion. Newspapers printed photos of him in handcuffs, the words "justice served" flashing across front pages, as if that alone could close such a story. But anyone who knew the Congdons, or had followed the twists of their family drama, understood that nothing about this case was simple. Beneath the surface of that verdict lay a network of lies and manipulation so complex that even seasoned investigators would later admit they had never seen anything quite like it. In the quiet aftermath of the trial, Marjorie Congdon played her part with chilling precision. She appeared composed, poised, even sympathetic, portraying herself as the grieving daughter of a murdered mother and the wife of a man unjustly condemned. She was never charged with any crime at that point, though her shadow loomed over the entire case. In public, she insisted she had nothing to do with it, but privately, people began to whisper that her hands weren't clean. Roger Caldwell went to prison for life, but something about the case refused to settle. His conviction was built largely on circumstantial evidence, no fingerprints, no witnesses, no direct proof he'd even been in Duluth that night. The prosecution had leaned heavily on motive, money, desperation, and Marjorie's relentless need for control. But motive alone, some argued, wasn't enough to put a man behind bars for murder. Over the next few years, cracks began to appear. Key witnesses recanted parts of their testimonies, inconsistencies surfaced in the investigation, and the defense pushed for a retrial. Then, in 1982, the unthinkable happened. After serving only a few years of his sentence, Roger Caldwell's conviction was overturned. He agreed to plead guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder, not because he admitted to killing anyone, but to avoid a second trial that might end with the same result. And in exchange, he was released from prison. But if that seemed like freedom, it wasn't the kind anyone would envy. Roger's life unraveled almost immediately after his release. The years behind bars had broken him. Friends said he was haunted by guilt, by betrayal, by the sense that he'd been a pawn in someone else's game. In 1988, alone and despairing, he took his own life. Before he died, he told people that Marjorie had ruined him, that he'd been manipulated from the very beginning. And if that sounds like the bitter words of a man with nothing left to lose, you might think twice, because what came next made his claims far harder to dismiss. You see, the story of Glensheen didn't end with Elizabeth's murder. For most people, that night in 1977 was the climax. For Marjorie Congdon, it was only the beginning. After Roger's death, she moved from state to state, changing names, relationships, and addresses like she was trying to stay one step ahead of something, or someone. But trouble followed her wherever she went. Fires broke out at her homes under suspicious circumstances. Insurance claims piled up. Friends and business partners began to notice strange patterns, money disappearing, documents altered, stories that didn't quite add up. By the late 1980s, Marjorie's name had become synonymous with scandal. She was accused of fraud, forgery, arson, you name it. In Arizona, investigators connected her to a string of fires that seemed to erupt whenever money was tight. In Colorado, she faced charges related to theft and deceit. Each time, she managed to avoid long prison sentences, always slipping through the cracks just before the walls could close in. It was as if her life had become a macabre echo of her family's downfall, greed and control twisting everything it touched. And yet, even as her reputation darkened, she still found people willing to believe her. That was perhaps her greatest talent, not wealth, not charm, but persuasion. She could make people trust her, pity her, even protect her. There's a kind of quiet danger in that, a manipulation so subtle that by the time you realize what's happening, it's too late. Meanwhile, Glensheen itself had become something else entirely. The mansion, still standing proud on its lakeside perch, was no longer a private home. The Congdon family eventually donated it to the University of Minnesota Duluth, transforming it into a museum. Its ornate rooms were open to the public, its history preserved behind velvet ropes and guided tours. Visitors came to admire the craftsmanship, the architecture, the art, but it was the story that drew them in. Because the truth is, Glensheen's beauty can't be separated from its darkness. You can walk those grand staircases and imagine the laughter that once filled the rooms, but you can't escape the ghost of that night in 1977. The place feels alive somehow. The silence has weight. Even the sunlight through the stained glass seems a little muted, as if it's remembering something it can't forget. Tour guides, careful not to sensationalize, rarely mention the murders in detail. They'll talk about the Congdon legacy, the philanthropy, the architectural brilliance, but if you pay attention, you'll sense what's left unsaid. You'll notice the subtle tension when the conversation brushes too close to Elizabeth's bedroom, or the staircase where Velma fell. It's not superstition, it's reverence. The people who maintain Glensheen today understand that beauty and tragedy coexist there in ways words can barely contain. And perhaps that's what makes it so haunting. Glensheen isn't just a crime scene or a relic of excess, it's a portrait of human contradiction. A family that built their fortune on progress and vision, undone by the very greed they once tried to rise above. A daughter who inherited everything except the one thing her mother wanted for her: peace. It's almost poetic in a way. The mansion that was meant to symbolize permanence became a monument to impermanence. Time wore down the Congdon legacy just as it does every dynasty. The iron that built Duluth turned to rust, the money scattered. The family name, once synonymous with progress, became shorthand for tragedy. And still, Glensheen remains. It endures not just as a building, but as a reminder. Because the story it tells, of ambition, love, betrayal, and loss, isn't confined to its walls. It's the same story that played out in mansions and estates across America during the Gilded Age, where wealth promised immortality but delivered only illusion. If you visit today, you might stand on the back terrace and look out over Lake Superior. The waves move the same way they did when Chester Congdon stood there over a century ago, dreaming of his family's future. The water is cold and endless, the wind sharp against the face, the horizon infinite. For a moment, it's easy to see why he built his home here, on the edge of something vast and untamable. But as the wind howls against the old stone walls, it's also easy to feel what he couldn't have known, that someday, the fortune he worked for, the mansion he built, and even the family name he cherished would become part of a story no one could have imagined. A story not of triumph, but of tragedy, echoing endlessly like the waves against the shore. There's something eerie about standing inside a place where time feels trapped. At Glensheen, the air carries a faint chill even in summer, and the silence doesn't feel empty, it feels watchful. Every polished surface reflects not just light, but memory. The kind of memory that refuses to fade no matter how many years pass. People say that when you walk the mansion's upper hall at night, you can hear the faint creak of footsteps on the old wooden floorboards. They'll tell you it's the house settling, or the wind off the lake sneaking through the cracks. But some insist it's more than that. That Glensheen remembers. Of course, whether you believe in ghosts or not, the truth is haunting enough. What happened to the Congdon family wasn't just a tragedy of violence, it was a tragedy of legacy. Because everything Chester Congdon built, every ounce of discipline, foresight, and generosity he poured into that estate, collapsed under the weight of what came after him. To understand that collapse, you have to look beyond the murder and into what the Gilded Age really represented. America in the early 1900s was obsessed with grandeur. The mansions built during that time were more than homes. They were physical declarations of arrival. The Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Vanderbilts, they all built monuments to their own permanence. The Congdons were no different. Glensheen was their cathedral of progress, their way of saying, we made it. But wealth, especially inherited wealth, has a way of twisting meaning. What begins as ambition can harden into entitlement. What starts as vision can curdle into vanity, and when that happens, the walls themselves seem to absorb it. After the murders, after the trials, after Marjorie drifted into a trail of fraud and arson, the Congdon name became a ghost of itself. The surviving members of the family tried to live quietly, to separate themselves from the shadow that had fallen over them. But Glensheen was always there, looming, patient, and unchanging. The house outlived them all. In a way, it had to. Because Glensheen's story wasn't just about the Congdons, it was about America itself, about how quickly beauty can decay when it's built on fragile ideals. Take Chester's vision. He believed in the idea of progress through discipline and innovation, and in his lifetime, it worked. He rose from a modest background to become one of Minnesota's most powerful men. But what he couldn't have predicted was how his very success would isolate his descendants from the values that had created it. By the time Marjorie inherited her share of the Congdon wealth, that money was no longer tied to work or vision or contribution. It was just money. Abstract, weightless, corrosive. It's the same story that's played out in countless dynasties throughout history. The first generation builds, the second maintains, and the third squanders. And in that sense, Glensheen's downfall wasn't unique, it was inevitable. But what makes it unforgettable is how spectacularly it all came undone. The mansion that once symbolized grace and success ended up becoming the setting of a crime so intimate, so shocking, that it erased the very dignity it was built to preserve. Yet even that isn't the full story. Because in the years after the murders, as Glensheen transformed into a museum, something fascinating happened. People didn't turn away from it, they were drawn to it. Crowds came not just to see the beauty, but to feel the chill. To stand where the Congdons had stood and imagine the moment when everything changed. It's a strange thing, isn't it? How tragedy draws us in. How we're compelled by the tension between elegance and horror. Maybe it's because places like Glensheen hold up a mirror. They remind us that no matter how high we climb, no matter how polished the exterior, the darkness inside us always finds a way to surface. Today, if you visit, you'll walk through the library first, a masterpiece of carved oak and stained glass. Chester's books still line the shelves, volumes of law, literature, and philosophy. His desk sits in perfect order, as if he just stepped away for a moment. The fire doesn't burn anymore, but you can almost hear it crackle, the sound of an age when men like him believed intellect could solve anything. Then you move through the drawing room, where sunlight pours through leaded glass windows onto Persian rugs and gilded furniture. It's breathtaking, almost overwhelming in its detail. And then you remember, this beauty became the backdrop to something monstrous. Upstairs, the tone shifts. The bedrooms are preserved exactly as they were in 1977. Elizabeth's room feels untouched, her bed neatly made, her personal items still in place, an unsettling snapshot of a life interrupted. The soft light filtering through lace curtains does little to dull the heaviness in the air. Visitors describe an unshakable sensation that someone is still there. It's here that Glensheen's story transcends the true crime narrative it's often reduced to. Because it's not just about who killed whom or why, it's about what this place says about us. About our belief that money can protect us, that beauty can shield us, that legacy can outlive our flaws. In the end, Glensheen proves the opposite. It shows that even the most magnificent structures can't contain the frailty of human nature. And that's what keeps people coming back. The mansion, with its quiet grandeur and its unspeakable history, feels like a living contradiction, one that refuses to resolve. There's a saying among historians: every house has two stories, the one it tells and the one it hides. Glensheen's hidden story is written not in blueprints or ledgers, but in silence, in the pauses between the creaks of the staircase and the hum of the lake wind. If you stay long enough, that silence begins to speak. It tells of ambition turned sour, of love turned controlling, of loyalty betrayed. It whispers that beauty without balance always breaks. And maybe that's why, even after all these years, Glensheen still feels alive. Because it isn't just a mansion, it's a lesson carved in stone, one that time keeps repeating, and one we keep refusing to learn. If you stand on the back terrace of Glensheen at dawn, when the fog from Lake Superior rolls in thick as smoke, the mansion looks almost unreal. The great stone walls fade into the mist, the windows glint faintly, and the sound of the waves becomes a heartbeat, slow, steady, eternal. In those moments, you can almost imagine the house breathing, remembering. The truth is, places like Glensheen never really forget. They simply wait for people to look close enough to see what's still there. For decades after the murders, Glensheen's caretakers faced a question that was as delicate as the estate itself. How do you preserve a place with such a violent past? Do you protect the beauty and downplay the horror, or do you tell the whole story, no matter how uncomfortable it is? For a long time, the answer leaned toward silence. The tours were gentle, factual, focused on architecture and design. Guests would ask in whispers about the murders. Guides would smile politely and move on. The darkness of 1977 was treated like an uninvited guest at a dinner party, acknowledged only with a glance. But time has a way of changing what we can face. As the decades passed, more people began to see that Glensheen's power lay not in hiding its past, but in embracing it. Because the story of this mansion isn't just about a family's fall, It's about how beauty and horror coexist in the same breath, how ambition and decay are sometimes just two sides of the same coin. You can sense that duality everywhere. In the marble fireplaces that glow warm and golden under lamplight, you see the brilliance of human craft, but you also remember that this same fireplace once burned quietly in the background of betrayal. In the music room, where a grand piano sits untouched, you can almost hear the echo of laughter from a century ago, before that laughter curdled into silence. Even the gardens, immaculate, peaceful, framed by stone balustrades, carry a strange melancholy, as if they too are mourning what was lost. There's something poetic about the way the house survived everything that tried to destroy it. Fire, scandal, decay, each left its mark, but none could erase the essence of what Glensheen is. A contradiction made manifest, a place where dreams and nightmares share the same roof. What most people don't realize is that the story didn't just end with the Congdons or with Marjorie's trail of chaos. It lingers in every visitor who walks through those halls and feels that quiet tug of fascination mixed with unease. Because Glensheen isn't just history, it's a mirror. It reflects back the same dangerous curiosity that built it, that hunger for more, for control, for permanence. The same hunger that ultimately consumed the family who called it home. There's a moment on the guided tour that captures this perfectly. Guests are led into the breakfast room, a small, sunlit space overlooking the water. It's not as grand as the other rooms, but it's intimate, comfortable, the kind of place where you can imagine the family starting their mornings. Chester reading the paper, Clara stirring her tea, children giggling. For a brief instant, you can almost forget everything that came later. And then, as the guide begins to move the group toward the staircase, you glance at the doorframe, and it hits you. This was the same passageway through which death entered the house. That's the unsettling magic of Glensheen. It doesn't need to show you its ghosts, it makes you feel them. In the years since the estate opened to the public, tens of thousands have come through its doors, each one leaving with a slightly different version of its story. Some remember the opulence, others the tragedy, but nearly everyone leaves with a question, a quiet wondering about how something so beautiful could hold something so ugly. And that question is exactly what keeps Glensheen alive. Because at its core, the mansion isn't just a remnant of the past, it's a parable. It asks us to consider what happens when success becomes obsession, when legacy becomes weight, when love turns to control. It's a reminder that no amount of marble or silk or grandeur can protect a family from itself. In a way, Glensheen is the perfect metaphor for the Gilded Age. The period glittered on the surface, promising progress and prosperity, but beneath that shine was a rot that no one wanted to see: child labor, inequality, moral decay hidden under chandeliers. Chester Congdon was part of that world, though perhaps more idealistic than many of his peers. He wanted to believe that his wealth could build something good, something lasting, and for a while, it did. But like so many dreamers of that era, he couldn't escape the truth that everything built on human ambition eventually bends under the weight of its own flaws. It's strange to think that this man, so careful, so measured, so forward-thinking, could never have imagined that his grand estate would one day become a murder museum, that his family name would be spoken not in reverence but in hushed fascination. But that's the thing about legacy. You can design a building to last forever, but you can't design what history will do with it. Today, the people who work at Glensheen take pride in preserving it, not as a haunted house, but as a living lesson. They know the allure of its darkness, but they also understand its light. The Congdons weren't monsters. They were human, flawed, complicated, driven by love and fear like everyone else. The tragedy that unfolded there isn't just a story of greed, it's a story of how even the most privileged lives can crumble when trust and empathy collapse. If you step out onto the terrace again as the day fades, you'll see the lake stretching endlessly into the horizon, just as Chester once did. The wind carries the same chill, the same rhythm, the same promise of permanence. But if you look back toward the house, you'll see something different. You'll see that Glensheen isn't just standing, it's enduring. Not because it's untouched by time, but because it carries every moment, every scar, every secret within it. That's what makes it powerful. The mansion is no longer a home. It's a confession carved into stone, a reminder that beauty can't exist without darkness, and that every generation, no matter how wealthy or wise, has to decide what it's willing to sacrifice to keep the illusion alive. Glensheen doesn't give answers. It doesn't tell you what to think. It just stands there, quiet and unflinching, letting you draw your own conclusions. And as you walk away, back through the iron gates and toward the ordinary world beyond, one thought lingers like the taste of cold air. Some houses keep their ghosts locked away. Glensheen invites them to stay.